I this summer I have been reading through a couple of things. One is the Percival legends from kind of the Arthurian mythology. Percival the knight, who is kind of most closely associated with the Grail, the quest for the Grail, and the Fisher King. I've also been reading a couple of books on kind of psychological themes of that part of the Arthurian legend. And part of what got me to do that is I've been thinking a lot, which I have thought about this poem throughout my life, but I've been thinking a lot again about the poem "The Wasteland," which is very self-consciously connected thematically to Arthurian legend and to the Fisher King motif in particular. In the wasteland is kind of the thing that shows up in Percival's story. So that's had me thinking about some things like uh, kind of big literary epochs or eras in the English language, specifically like Romanticism to Modernism to Postmodernism. But I just recently started reading Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road again. I think this is going to be the second time that I've read it, and the first time that I read it, I was a teenager, and so now I'm middle-aged man, and like a lot of people, I was like a little bit nervous to reread it because I enjoyed it so much as a younger person, but I was kind of having this expectation that kind of like watching a movie that you loved whenever you were younger, you almost get nervous that it's going to kind of like ruin the place that movie occupies in your mind whenever you watch it again with kind of the perspective of an older person. But like a lot of people who've made YouTube videos about their experience of going back to the novel in middle age, I'm actually enjoying the heck out of it, and I've been very pleasantly surprised by how much I'm enjoying it, and how much meat I feel like there is on the bone. I haven't had that experience with some of the other novels that really kind of like rung my bell in a really significant way when I was younger. Not like I don't enjoy them again whenever I'm older, but I don't have the same kind of experience of just being like kind of swept up with them. So I thought about waiting to kind of talk about this until I finished On the Road, but I was actually on a run this morning and thinking about it, and I thought, I think I kind of want to just capture some thoughts now, almost like in the Jack Kerouac tradition, trying to kind of do it maybe a little bit more stream of consciousness, a little bit more kind of like while I'm in the moment. There's kind of two big categories of things that I kind of want to think through by talking through. So one of them is thinking about like what kind of novel is On the Road. If you try to kind of think about it categorically, not like that's always helpful, but sometimes it can be. But trying to think about like what is the kind of like epochal movement type thing that it would most naturally align with. So that's one kind of idea that I'm interested in thinking about. And then the second one would be thinking about themes of maturation, both in On the Road, but also thinking about how what kind of a place On the Road could fill in like a broader kind of like meta idea of what it means to grow up, to mature. And that's the thing I think you can actually trace through its relationship to other works, to other writers or artists, but also even in its when you think about where like what kind of thematic literary period it aligns with, those periods have their own story about kind of like personal development and human development. And so thinking about the way that the book fits into a kind of like a trajectory through a succession of literary traditions, I think is also kind of an interesting thing to kind of consider. So those are the two big things I was interested in talking about. So the first one, just trying to kind of think about what kind of a novel is On the Road. What's the right kind of like literary category or era or movement to maybe think about it having a place in. And so if you think about some of the things that On the Road gets compared to, one of the things would be like Thoreau and Walt Whitman. So those are, two of the kind of most important writers in the American Romantic tradition. And they get talked about explicitly in the book. And also the book's been compared to stuff that Whitman and Thoreau have written. Um, but uh, but that time period, I think just about anybody that would try to kind of like tell you what the definition is of the American Romantic period, it would have ended a long time before Jack Kerouac wrote. So if we think about where he sits chronologically, so the action in the book is happening just after World War II. The book gets published in the 50s, but the action is kind of set, in the late 40s, right into the beginning of the 1950s. So that would kind of be more like kind of late modernism, early postmodernism. And if you also just think about like the beat writers and kind of some of the movements or some of the stuff that they kind of got connected to and associated with, they were kind of like, proto hippies. There was a kind of like a chaos anarchism sort of strain in the kind of common conceptions of what it meant to be a beat writer. And that would kind of go along a little bit more with kind of our ideas of like what postmodernism is. And Allen Ginsberg definitely had a little bit maybe more of that kind of like almost like a combination of like anarchism on the one hand, socialism, qua communism on the other. And not so much as like political movements, but just in terms of like ways of life, how, so everybody living together, making a living is less important than making meaning and having experiences. And you get by just by pooling your resources and pulling together to make it from experience to experience, which is also kind of more of like a hippie way of life, So, and that's kind of like definitely part of even the way that you see the crew in On the Road making their living, kind of making their way in the world. But what I would kind of, I guess, maybe kind of posit is that like thinking about it now, coming back to it at this time in my life, it seems like the ethos of the book is just way more of a just straight up romantic sort of deal, and it's like it's just basically kind of like this celebration of youth, like the kind of romantic idea of kind of a celebration of nature, and that nature is, even whenever nature is harsh, nature is still beautiful, and has kind of like a softness and an allure to it. Specifically, the nature that we experience is kind of like the American landscape, and it's nature in terms of kind of like the outdoors, but it's also nature kind of almost in a like the what I often think of as kind of like the Jewish conception of what God's creation is, which is everything that's around you is part of creation. All of that is the created world, the created order, and all of it is good. And there's elements of sin or bad stuff in it, but the foundational thing, the root thing, is a good thing. And it's almost like every single thing that gets encountered, whether it's kind of like our traditional conception of nature, like a mountain range or the rain or a sunset, that is celebrated viciously, voraciously in On the Road. But then it's also other forms of nature, like a person and the outfit that they wear and the diction that they speak with. Those aren't, my feeling when I'm reading it is those things aren't viewed as like conventions. Those are viewed as like a natural state sort of a thing. And Jack Kerouac's character is super excited when he encounters like somebody in a cowboy hat, somebody with a certain kind of an accent, somebody who carries something a certain way or eats in a certain way, and those things are celebrated in a kind of like rejoicing in nature sort of a thing. It feels to me extremely similar to Song of Myself and Walt Whitman. And obviously that's probably going to be a thing that was part of what made Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac connect with each other. So I would almost say, like while I'm thinking about it right now, that I feel like this book is, even though it maybe doesn't fit chronologically, it is a romantic novel in the American romantic tradition, very, very much so. And you don't necessarily have to be in the kind of natural chronology of a literary period for it to make a lot of sense for you to be part of that period. Another good example of that would be the novel Moby Dick, which, like, I know for me, whenever the only time that I ever had a chance to engage Moby Dick critically and in a scholarly way was in a class that I had in college on American Romantic literature. But so we read Thoreau in that class, we read Whitman in that class, but we also read Melville, and we read Moby Dick, and like it wasn't hard to see that Moby Dick was vastly different. And again, this idea of of nature, man's natural state, the universe's natural state, and the idea of nature personified, or maybe the God that made nature or that lives in nature, having a adversarial relationship to mankind. That was way more of a thing in Moby Dick than it was in anything else that we read in that class. So like, to me, whenever I think of Moby Dick, I would think of it more as a modernist novel, and less of a romantic novel, although it lived in the Romantic period, what we think of as the Romantic period, and has a super interesting relationship to other things that were written in that period. So I think similarly, On the Road is like that. I'm thinking of On the Road now as a novel in the American Romantic tradition, and it has a relationship. What's kind of interesting is, since it came even after what we would kind of think of as the Modernist period ending, or right at the tail end of the Modernist period and the beginning of the Postmodern period, the fact that it's a romantic novel written in a time period when we're supposed to be way past the ideals of Romanticism is kind of an interesting way to even engage with the book. So when I think about kind of like Romanticism, modernism, postmodernism, maybe this could be a helpful thing to talk about. So part of what I think of with Romanticism would be like celebration of youth, celebration of nature. What you find is beautiful. Everything around you is beautiful. If you think of it if you're familiar with the book Christ and Culture by, I can't remember if it's Richard or Reinhold Niebuhr, but one of the Niebuhr brothers. So it's a book specifically about like hermeneutics and Christian theology, but it's also a way to think about sociology in general. And it's kind of this relationship between the supreme good, which would be Christ in that book, and the world that we live in, which would be culture or society. And so if I think about Romanticism in the terminology of the Christ and Culture, Christ of culture, where the Godhead, the godlike being that exists in the world is synonymous with culture, society, with our circumstance. There's something beautiful in everything you encounter, something worthy of celebration, and maybe even veneration and worship in everything that you encounter. You just have to be open to experiencing it the right way. To me, I view that very much as a romantic principle, and that is like massively on display and On the Road. And it's also described in a way that's really compelling. It's you feel like that's true because of how compellingly the case is made. And it's not, the case isn't made polemically, like there's no argument. The case is just made because you see Jack Kerouac's character having experiences with the divine in everything that he encounters, and his experience is described so compellingly that you're participating in it and you believe in it. So to me, it's a romantic story in that respect. But and again, I'm not like super up on critical theory about On the Road or scholarly theory, so there might be some stuff here that I'm not aware of. But like, I would kind of think that On the Road is viewed probably more as kind of like a proto-postmodern sort of a novel, and that it's written kind of like as something that's like on the way, in kind of like an ironic sense, to what ultimately kind of became the big expressions of postmodernism. So if Romanticism is kind of like this celebration of youth, celebration of nature, celebration of what is, modernism then is a little bit of skepticism about what is. And then postmodernism is maybe, I'd say modernism is skepticism about what is, optimism about what things can become. And we don't always experience modernism as super optimistic, but I think that there is some optimism in it. But that being said, then I think postmodernism is kind of like, and there's different strains of this, but basically we're kind of, the optimism is gone, and so maybe it's that optimism leaves in the form that that leaving takes is that everything is meaningless, or that everything is absurd, and that the right attitudes. So it's silly to look for systems of meaning. It's so silly that the best thing to do is to just laugh at it. So that's kind of like one softer, maybe more palatable version of postmodernism. And then there are other kinds that are kind of more just flat out, like just there's no meaning in anything. So it's kind of like, and maybe another way to talk about that progression would be Romanticism is life is meaningful, life is beautiful. Modernism is we don't think that life is meaningful, and we need to fight for a way to redeem it. Postmodernism is life is not meaningful, life is meaningless, but also death is meaningless. And so it's all meaningless. It's all kind of a big joke. And you can actually find meaning, satisfaction, fulfillment in enjoying the joke. That's kind of like, and again, not like those are perfectly comprehensive statements, but those are maybe some ways to think about progression through those three cycles of thought. So then if you take that as a given, then one question could be, does On the Road think that things are meaningless and that things maybe the best thing to do is to just take it as a joke? Well, there's kind of a little bit of that. And if you think about some of the things that come on the tails of On the Road, like Slaughterhouse Five, Catch 22, the Magic School Bus type stuff, Tim Leary. So there is a little bit of just like full-on absurdist stuff, and sometimes it even takes a very similar shape to like being in a car, driving around, crazy stuff's happening to you, and and this is just kind of the wildness and the craziness of life. But to me, what I'm finding in On the Road is there's a little bit more of a sense of like structure and purpose and direction. Maybe actually even more than I was thinking I remembered seeing in it whenever I was younger, So almost kind of like a formalism. And one of the ways I've thought about this is, so like we know all about how important jazz is to On the Road and to the Beats in general. Well, one of the ways that people bucked against jazz initially is it felt like it was an abandonment of form. And one of the things, music is a very mathematical thing. And one of the ways that we've understood beauty in music over big swaths of time is getting really good at playing with the forms, getting, different, the way that different instruments sound against each other, the difference between, like harmony is kind of like two things that sound very different independently of each other, and you put them together. And not only does the complement sound really good, but the product that you get is a sound that you lose the two component parts in the combination. Or maybe it isn't even so much that you lose them, but like a first and a fifth, if you play them and they're perfectly in tune, you hear the third. And even though the third's not being played. So there's elements with music where formalism is so important to it that it's hard to imagine how music gets produced without the form. And then that's part of what I think made people uncomfortable with and maybe chafe a little bit against jazz. But as time has passed, what we've seen is that jazz has formal elements in it that were new. This is also similar with Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was viewed as a guy that like jettisoned form, but as a scholarly tradition developed around his work, people realized that actually there's a Whitmanian form that's just as rigorous, just as helpful in creating meaning, but the form was so different that it was almost unrecognizable as form whenever it first kind of came into being. So I think there's something kind of interesting like that you could say is also happening with On the Road. So On the Road's form is jazzy. It's what Jack Kerouac called bop prosody, but it's this idea of, so there's phrasing that's similar to jazz phrasing. There's improvisation that's similar to jazz, and all of us have heard the stories about him talking about kind of like how spontaneously he created On the Road, how he taped together those teletype pages to be able to type continuously without having to even make page breaks. And that's both the story that we're all familiar with, but there's also lots of stories, lots of evidence about how meticulously Jack Kerouac crafted On the Road, about how he edited it, and also how he did write it over time. So there's even a tension there. And obviously, like, the mythology around a great work of literature is always kind of part of the great work of literature, and that's going to be true here, just like it is with any other great work. So that mythology is appropriate, but even in the spontaneity, the stream of consciousness, the improvisational flow of how he created, he was doing it with intention, with form. He was looking for echoes of his own themes to bring them back through the work, just like you hear in music, but also echoes of other great themes that help you root what he's doing in a broader tradition. And again, I would go back to Thoreau and Whitman as two big themes that come up again. Also, the Bible, which is an important clue or key in understanding Whitman's meter as well, because the Psalms are very much kind of like how he thought about creating structure in his own writing. So anyway, so the moral of that story there is that I think that you've got, and the modernists are known as writers who are extremely devoted to form, but did not automatically adopt formalism in the way, like they didn't just write a Shakespearean sonnet. They had strong metrical and formal elements in what they wrote. Even the fictional writers did, not just the poets. But they played around with that structure and with that form in a way that helps communicate the message and tell the story. And The Wasteland, of course, is a super good example of that. And speaking of The Wasteland and speaking of T.S. Eliot, one of the things I've been thinking about with On the Road too is that, so, like T.S. Eliot is kind of like the pinnacle of modernism, also kind of the pinnacle of the skepticism of the meaning of life, which The Wasteland is like very much about. But what I've been thinking about is how much proof rock feels not like, I haven't made like super tight textual connections, but the feeling in On the Road and proof rock are very similar to me. That there's this attempt to kind of like grab this ephemeral thing that has something to do with being young. And in proof rock, it's kind of sad because it's like you can't grab it. On the Road, it's like exciting and intense because you're working hard to grab it, but it's really slippery. But those two things feel really similar and really kind of connected to me. So I guess as of right now, we'll see as I kind of progress through the book, but like I'm not feeling any sort of like defeatist or absurdist feelings that I would kind of like think of as being stuff that goes along with being postmodern. And again, I haven't read a lot of Allen Ginsberg in a while, but when I just kind of think about like my gut level feeling of like how I've encountered and experienced Allen Ginsberg, that's part of what I would assign to him. Now I love that in postmodernism, specifically for me personally, one of the big ways that that's been important to me has been through punk rock and through the ideas of like the absurdity of life that comes out of punk rock. But even in thinking about that, like one of the things I've thought about with On the Road is I would put it way more in like the social distortion camp of punk rock, where, and I would say social distortion would be a good example of like having romantic visions of youth. Like when you think about remembering, it's like the bittersweetness of remembering youth in Story of My Life, but also the sadness of where Mike Ness or the speaker in that song finds himself in this post-teenage world where the pool hall that he loved as a kid is now a 7-Eleven, and he doesn't even want to go get a job because he knows what he looks like and how he'll be judged. To me, that feels like a Wasteland sort of a story, and it also feels like an On the Road sort of a story, but On the Road maybe hasn't gotten to that level of like, the way I get that feeling in On the Road is how Jack Kerouac is thinking about the writing that he's doing, the work that he's doing. He's not this like careening out of control, like he comes off of one guardrail on the highway and veers across and rams into the other, because he was like in his room working hard, writing his novel at home. In fact, there's one spot early on when I think it's his aunt that he's living with. She comes to get him, and what he describes is, I was in there studying hard. So he's not a student at this point. He's an author. He hasn't published a novel yet, but he's working on a novel. And he's in his room by himself, working super hard, so hard that his aunt's worried about him because of how hard he's working. But he's not in there working hard on writing, he's working hard on studying. Even that idea of himself is really interesting. It's a very different idea than the kind of like untethered rowdiness in the Neil Cassidy, Dean Moriarty character, who wants to be a writer, but is kind of out. You get this feeling that he's just out of control. And to me, that's more of like the anarchist sort of a punk rock versus like the social distortion sort of punk rock that has a little bit more of a sense of proportion, propriety, appropriateness, the arc of maturation. And there's a willingness to celebrate where you're at on that arc, but there's also this understanding that there's something that would be sad and not worthy of celebration if you're not actually on that arc. And that's what gets me back to the Arthurian legend and Percival. So if you lots of people have talked about like the depth psychology in myths and legends in general, but specifically in the Arthurian legends, and about how those were ways to understand what it meant to go from being a boy to a man. And so, when we think about like, when you think about like that time in history, castles and fair maidens and knights, like the way that we think about that in a really like surfacey way is a high romantic sort of a way of thinking. But when you think about it more in terms of kind of like trajectory, it's not, you don't stay in high romanticism. You have to grow into something else, So like the questing knight doesn't just live on the benevolence of nature for his entire life. So he's out there, living off the land, going from adventure to adventure. But there is kind of like this sense that there's a destination, a goal that's being worked toward. So part of it is actually getting back into fellowship with the other knights at Arthur's court. One of the things that's been fun to kind of like think about with Percival legend, again, going through it again, is that how Percival, as he defeats knights, he doesn't kill them and he doesn't shame them irreparably. Instead, he kind of like redeems them and he sends them back to court as his prisoner. But they go back to King Arthur's court and they become knights of the kingdom. And so, I've also been reading He by Robert Johnson. So an idea that's in there is that as if you think about the story as kind of like in a Jungian kind of dream analysis sort of a way, where every member of the story is also a piece of Percival's psyche. He's not fighting these parts of himself. He's doing business with them, and then he's figuring out ways to redeem them. And when he does, he integrates them and he sends them back to King Arthur's court. And actually he becomes in fellowship with them. They become part of, like, an actualized part of his person. And again, I get this feeling, at least again, at this stage in the game and on the road, that is the questing that Jack Kerouac is doing, that Jack Kerouac / Dean Moriarty is doing. He's questing like a knight like that. And his questing is not a Don Quixote absurdist sort of a questing. It's more of a Percival integrating sort of a questing. So I don't know. We'll see how I do as I kind of continue through the book, but that's kind of where I'm at right now. By the way, there's another interesting one, right? So Don Quixote predates all this stuff we're talking about. But I think one of the ways you can read it is as a early kind of like absurdist sort of a story. But that would be a whole nother topic of conversation. Is that absurdism the same kind of absurdism that we see in what we kind of traditionally think of as post-modernity? I kind of don't think it is. I think it's got more substance to it, which is part of the reason why it'll endure in a way that most of the tenets of postmodernism won't. But that's a pretty major rock for the waves of postmodernism to crash against. So don't expect most of their boats to be broken into small pieces against the rock of Don Quixote. But anyway, those are just some thoughts with kind of where I'm at right now. If you're interested in more thoughts like this, and if you would also be interested in leadership development work personally or in your organization, this is very similar to some of the stuff that we do in the Leader, Thinker, Fighter, Friend course. So I think I'll probably put a link to how you can get more information about that in the description of the video. But if you have thoughts about this, I'd love to hear about them in the comments too. So thanks for your time.